Welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. In the previous presentation, we looked at Genesis chapter 29, where we ended with Leah producing 4 sons for Jacob. And the scriptures ended in that chapter with the phrase, and Leah left bearing. And at that time, I mentioned that the reason why Leah stopped having children was because Rachel prevented Jacob from sleeping with Leah. And this presentation will prove that point when we get to Genesis chapter 30, round about verses 15 and 16. So this presentation is entitled Competition for Jacob's Love. And we'll be looking at the first half of Genesis chapter 30. So both Rachel and Leah will be competing for Jacob's attention and for Jacob's love. So this is what this presentation is all about. So in the previous presentation, we ended with Leah producing 4 sons, as I mentioned, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah for Jacob. And Genesis 29 ended with the statement that Leah left bearing, which means that she stopped having children. But this was not because Leah became infertile all of a sudden. It was due to the fact that Rachel would not allow Jacob to sleep with Leah anymore. Rachel got so jealous of Leah's ability to produce children when she couldn't, and gave Jacob an ultimatum, which essentially says, if you sleep with Leah anymore, you will not touch me again, essentially. And this takes us now to Genesis chapter 30, and we'll prove that assertion that I've made from the scriptures. Genesis chapter 30, verse 1 and 2 says this, and when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. So that was a problem. Rachel was jealous and she was envious of Leah's ability to have children, and not just children, but to produce sons. And she said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said unto her, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? So Rachel at this point in time, viewers, was desperate to prove her worth and value to the family by giving Jacob children. So the tension between the sisters was so palpable, and Jacob's reaction was one of frustration because of what was happening in the family, because he was caught in the middle of this competition between the sisters over him. But the truth of the matter is that Rachel was unable to get pregnant, even though Jacob was spending most, if not all of his time with Rachel in the evenings and in the nights in an attempt to get her pregnant. However, Jacob understood God's role in the bringing forth of children, which is why he responded the way he did, because he was clearly not the problem. Because as was evidenced by Leah, when Jacob slept with Leah, she became pregnant. So Jacob was not the one that had the problem. Rachel was the one with the problem. So Jacob was saying to her, I'm not the problem here, and it is God who decides when children are brought into this world. So Jacob said to her, I'm not God. Don't take it out on me. It is God who has withheld from thee the fruit of the womb. So take it to God in prayer. So Jacob understood how children are brought into this world. And notice what the psalmist tells us in Psalm 127, verse 3. Lo, children are an heritage of Jehovah, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. So it is God who decides to bless women and men with children. So no matter how men and women have intimacy, if God doesn't decide to open a woman's womb and make her fertile, and if he doesn't make the man virile, then no amount of sex that they are performing will bring babies into this world. It is God who is sovereign over the womb, and it is God who decides when children are brought into this world. And Jacob understood that simple fact. So viewers, Rachel was beautiful and she had the love of Jacob, but this was clearly not enough for her because she was jealous of Leah, which resulted in her being unhappy. And this led to a fierce competition between the sisters over who could give Jacob more children. And this will result in Rachel now giving her handmaiden to Jacob, just as how Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to produce children on her behalf. Notice what we read in Genesis 30, verse 3 to 6. And Rachel said, Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, sleep with her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. So she was now going to use Bilhah as a surrogate mother for her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And this phrase here, to wife, simply means she was using Bilhah as a concubine. Bilhah was not Jacob's wife. She was performing the role of a concubine, and I'll explain this further. And Jacob went in unto her. So Jacob slept with Bilhah, and Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. So there it is again. Rachel was a problem. Rachel was the one who was barren. Jacob was firing live rounds. He wasn't firing blanks. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son, because God opened Bilhah's womb. Bilhah was fertile. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan, and Dan means judge. She was essentially saying, God has heard her prayer and given her a son, even though it was done through Bilhah, her maid servant. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister. So there you can see the competition that was taking place between the sisters. So she said, after Bilhah conceived and gave birth to her second son, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. She's saying, I am winning this battle. And she called his name Naphtali. And Naphtali simply means wrestling, because there was this competition between the sisters. So the competition between the two sisters was now evident, because Rachel understood that the family needed children, especially sons. So she willingly gave her servant to Jacob as a concubine, because she knew that as Jacob's legal wife, any offspring produced from this union between Jacob and Bilhah would be, quote unquote, her children, which is precisely why she stated, and I quote, that I, Rachel, may also obtain children by her, just as Leah has given Jacob children, end of quote. So that I also may obtain children by her. That's what Rachel said. Since Bilhah will be performing the role of a surrogate in Rachel's stead. And what is a surrogate? Who is a surrogate? A surrogate is a substitute, especially a person deputizing for another in a specific role or office. So in today's society, with the advancement in technology, a man doesn't have to sleep with a woman. All he would have to do is to artificially inseminate that woman. And that woman would then carry the baby to term. So the husband and the wife, they are unable to have children naturally. They will get the man's sperm, the wife's egg, and the doctors will fertilize that egg, and they will inseminate a third party, a surrogate, and that woman, that third party, would bring that child to term. And once that baby is born, the baby is the couple's child. But back then, they didn't have technology, so they had to do it the natural way. So Rachel provided Bilhah, her servant, to Jacob. Jacob slept with her, she became pregnant, and the child that was produced was Rachel and Jacob's child, even though Bilhah was the biological mother. So that was what was happening there. So Bilhah performed the role of a surrogate mother for Rachel. So note, keenly viewers, that it was Rachel who named Bilhah's two sons, because they were, quote unquote, Rachel's children. It must also be stated clearly that Jacob had only two wives, Leah and Rachel, because the sisters' two servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, were concubines. Concubines, as I explained in a previous presentation, were not legal wives, even though they are mentioned as wives in the scriptures. But the context always makes it clear that these women were performing the role of a concubine. notice the verses below that even though Bilhah was given to Jacob to quote-unquote wife in Genesis 30 verse 4, Bilhah is correctly referred to as his father's concubine in Genesis 35 verse 22. Notice what we read in Genesis 30 verse 3 and 4, and then we are going to look at Genesis 35 verse 22. It's on the screen. This is what Rachel said. Behold, my maid, go in unto her, sleep with her, and she shall bear upon my knees. And that's a phrase referring to she being a concubine, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her maid, to wife. This Hebrew word, wife, is the Hebrew word Isha. It is a general term used for a woman, and that woman can either be a married woman or an unmarried woman. And in this case, Bilhah did not marry Jacob. She was simply performing the role of a concubine, as is evidenced by verse 3. Rachel presented Bilhah to Jacob and said, sleep with her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I, Rachel, may also have children by her. So it is clear from the context of this verse that Bilhah was performing the role of a concubine, a surrogate mother for Rachel. And in Genesis 35 verse 22, we see that the scriptures makes it absolutely clear that Bilhah was not Jacob's legal wife, but his concubine. And notice what happened. And it came to pass when Israel, that's Jacob, that's when his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben, who was now grown, Leah's son, went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. So Reuben slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. And this was the reason why Reuben lost the birthright, because of this incident. And I looked at it in a previous presentation. So this makes it clear that Bilhah was not Jacob's legal wife. Neither was Zilpah, as we'll read about later. Jacob had only two wives, Leah, his first wife, and Rachel, his second wife. Bilhah and Zilpah were concubines. Viewers, when Leah realized that she wasn't going to get pregnant anymore due to the fact that Jacob was no longer sleeping with her because of Rachel, the competition between the two sisters then intensified, with Leah doing what Rachel did. So Leah said, I'm going to raise you one. Since you have done that, and you're not allowing Jacob to sleep with me anymore, I'm going to do what you have done. Notice Genesis 30 verse 9 to 13. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, and I explained what that meant, and I'll prove it after this, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. The same thing, to be a concubine. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah is going to do what Rachel did and name the child, because the child belonged to her as the legal wife. And Leah said, a troop cometh. And she called his name Gad. And Gad means a troop. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher, which means happy. So at this point in time, Jacob now has 8 sons, 4 sons with Leah. Reuben is firstborn, Simeon is secondborn, Levi is thirdborn, and then we have Judah. Rachel's handmaiden Bilhah gave Jacob 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. So that was 6 sons that Jacob now had. When Leah saw that that was the plan of Rachel, she did the same thing. She presented her maid Zilpah, who gave Jacob 2 sons as well. Gad is 7th born son, and Asher is 8th born son. So at this point in time, Jacob now had 8 sons. So the competition between the sisters intensified. This was a soap opera taking place in the home of Jacob between the 2 sisters, and now the 2 maids also were inserted into this toxic environment between the 2 sisters, competing for Jacob's attention and for Jacob's love. So viewers, That is what was happening in Jacob's life. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. He was caught in the middle of a rivalry between both Leah and Rachel over his love and his attention. So note again, viewers, that Leah's maid Zilpah also performed the role of a surrogate, and she gave birth to 2 sons as well. But it was Leah who named the boys because they were, quote unquote, Leah's children, and Zilpah was only a concubine. Leah clearly lost the praise that Judah brought because Judah means praise. Because of the baby competition, the baby mama drama that was happening in Jacob's life. And she only became happy again after Asher was born, because Asher means happy. So viewers, I made a bold assertion that Leah left bearing, or Leah stopped becoming pregnant because Jacob was no longer sleeping with her because of Rachel. Let's now prove for a fact that Rachel was instrumental and that Rachel was behind Leah not getting pregnant anymore because she prevented Jacob from sleeping with her. Notice what we are told in Genesis 30, verse 14 onwards. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel, being the jealous and the envious woman that she was, a very conceited woman, Rachel said to Leah, "Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes." So she demanded Reuben's mandrakes, because mandrake, viewers, is the Hebrew word dudai. It occurs 7 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 1736. It has been translated as mandrake 6 times and basket once. Mandrake to the Hebrew was called love apple. It was an aphrodisiac, and it was believed to be capable of making a woman fertile. So it says as exciting sexual desire, meaning it's an aphrodisiac, and favoring procreation. That is why Rachel wanted Reuben's mandrake, because she wanted it to assist her, to help her in becoming pregnant. So she demanded the mandrakes. And verse 15 says this. Notice Leah's response to Rachel when she demanded Reuben's mandrake. And Leah said unto her, "Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? So you have stolen my husband. You have prevented my husband from sleeping with me. And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also?" And notice Rachel's response. Rachel said, "Therefore he, Jacob, shall lie with thee tonight in exchange for thy son's mandrakes." So it is clear, viewers, that this verse makes it pellucid that Rachel was responsible for Jacob not sleeping with Leah anymore, because Leah accused Rachel of taking away her husband. So in other words, Rachel had Jacob on lockdown. Jacob could not fulfill his matrimonial duties in performing his sexual duty to Leah because of Rachel. And because he loved Rachel and for a peaceful life, Jacob acceded. He acquiesced to Rachel's demands, and he was no longer sleeping with Leah. Rachel, notice, viewers, did not contest Leah's accusation of taking away Leah's husband. In other words, preventing Jacob from sleeping with Leah anymore. So Rachel did not contest Leah's accusation because she knew it was true. And she relented by allowing Jacob to sleep with Leah that night in exchange for her son's mandrakes. That is what the text says. All you have to do is read between the lines, and it is actually explicit, because Leah accused her of taking away Jacob from her, and now she wanted to take away Reuben's mandrakes as well. And Rachel responded by saying, "Okay, you are right, you are correct. I'll allow Jacob to sleep with you tonight for a price for thy son's mandrakes." So notice what happened in verse 16 now. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him. She's happy. She has been given the green light, and said unto Jacob, thou must come in unto me. In other words, thou must sleep with me tonight. For surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. Leah, who is a legal wife, Jacob's first wife, has to be trading something in order to get Jacob to sleep with her. Notice what she says. Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And what happened? And Jacob lay with her that night. So he slept with her that night. And what was the outcome? And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the fifth son. So Leah didn't become infertile all of a sudden. She did not have any more children because Jacob was not sleeping with her anymore. And the very first time that Jacob slept with Leah again, Leah conceived and bare Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar, which means reward. So in other words, because I have given my husband, because I have been selfless, I gave my maiden Zilpah to my husband, God has now rewarded me. And Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued with me a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me. So there you can see, viewers, that it was a competition. And what was Leah's only wish? For Jacob to dwell with her. Because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun, which means dwelling. She wanted her husband to stay at home with her instead of living with Rachel all the time. And afterwards, Leah bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. And Dinah means judgment. So in other words, viewers, when Leah met Jacob, she told him that it was okay for him to sleep with her tonight because Rachel had given him the green light after they made a bargain over Reuben's mandrakes. And Rachel would not be upset with Jacob if he slept with Leah that night. So viewers, it's very clear that Rachel was the one calling the shots in the home. But it's also clear that this was a very dysfunctional family unit. It is quite apparent that Jacob resigned himself to this competition over him between the sisters. So for a peaceful life, he listened to Rachel. And there's a very famous saying which says, happy wife equals happy life. And that is what Jacob realized. So instead of the constant contention in the home, he listened to the love of his life, Rachel, and that brought the competition to another level. So the rivalry between the two sisters was so toxic to the harmony of the home that it actually confirms the wisdom of God's plan for marriage. Notice God's plan for marriage. Genesis 2 verse 24, we are going back to the origin. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother. So Jacob left Isaac and Rebekah and shall cleave unto his wife, singular, and they shall be one flesh. So the husband and the wife shall become one flesh. Marriage, viewers, was intended by God to be one man and one woman for life. 2 people are a couple. And when a third person is included into the marriage situation, it will always lead to jealousy, stress, and strife, which is precisely why God would later command and forbid the marrying of sisters as a result of what transpired with Jacob marrying both Leah and Rachel in Genesis 29 and 30. Notice what God commanded in the book of Leviticus chapter 18 verse 18. Neither shall a man take a wife to her sister to vex her. In other words, to make her jealous, to uncover her nakedness, that is to sleep with her beside the other in her lifetime. So in other words, a man must not marry his wife's sister as long as his wife is alive. That was God's command. Here are other translations which makes it a little clearer from other versions of the Bible. So the New International Version says, do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. The New Living Translation says this, while your wife is living, do not marry her sister and have sexual relations with her, for they would be rivals. And this is precisely what was taking place in Jacob's life. It wasn't Jacob's fault. He was tricked into marrying Leah because he worked 70 years for Rachel, but Laban tricked him and he ended up with 2 wives. So Jacob was not at fault in this situation. So you can look at the other verses that speaks about the fact that a man should not marry his wife's sister while his wife is alive. His wife has died and he's now a widower, then by all means, he could marry his wife's sister. Additionally, viewers, arising out of what Rachel did, which was unkind, uncaring, and unfeeling, by withholding Leah's conjugal rights, God gave this command as a remedy. Notice Exodus 21, verse 7 to 11. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, so he has married her, but she no longer pleases him, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing he had dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed this maidservant unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters, because she is now his daughter-in-law. Notice what God goes on to say, if that is the case. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. Her duty of marriage means her sexual intimacy. And notice what God goes on to say in verse 11. And if he do not these 3 things, so if he doesn't continue with her food, he doesn't provide clothing for her, and he refuses to have sex with her, then shall she go out free without money. So he is not allowed to sell her. Here are other versions and translations that makes it a little clearer for persons who may have a problem with interpreting the King James Version. Exodus 21 verse 10 says this. This is the NIV. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. The NLT says, if a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights, and notice, these are rights. He must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. Notice Exodus 21 verse 11, other translations. NIV, if he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. NLT says, if he fails in any of these 3 obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. So viewers, notice that after siring 10 sons with Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, Jacob became the father to his only daughter, Dinah. Finally, in his own time, God opened Rachel's womb, which is proof positive that God is in control, and he is the only one that decides when children are to be brought into this world. So viewers, it was after Rachel started to treat Leah right, and it was after she allowed Jacob to start sleeping again with Leah that God remembered Rachel, verse 22 to verse 24. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her. So it was clear that she was praying to God constantly to have a child. God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. So viewers, Leah as well as Rachel were barren. Their wombs were closed. Initially, the scriptures tell us that when God saw that Leah was hated, in other words, Leah was unloved, as I looked at in the previous presentation, God opened Leah's womb. God could only open something that has been closed or is closed. So Leah also was barren. But because God saw the situation and that Leah was unloved, Jacob did not want her. He only had eyes for Rachel. When God saw that God is just, God is fair, God opened Leah's womb and Leah became fertile. And she had 6 sons for Jacob. Rachel was also barren. The scripture says when God saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So both sisters were barren. So now after Rachel started to treat Leah right by not withholding her husband from her, God hearkened to Rachel and he opened her womb. And she gave birth to a son, which we'll now read about in Genesis chapter 30, 23, and 24. And Rachel conceived and bare a son and said, God had taken away my reproach, because a woman's value and a woman's worth was in her having the ability to produce children for her husband, and in particular, sons, because it was a patriarchal society. Sons were valuable, more valuable than daughters. So when Rachel finally conceived and gave birth to a son, she said, God had taken away my reproach, and she called his name Yosef, or in English, Joseph. And Yosef in Hebrew means Yehovah, that's God, has added. She called his name Joseph and said, Yehovah shall add to me another son. So viewers, that brings us to the end of the first half of Genesis chapter 30, where we looked at this baby mama drama that took place between Leah and Rachel as they competed for Jacob's love, Jacob's affection, and we saw what transpired. In the second half, we will now take it up with Jacob wanting to return home to the land of Canaan. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and may you stay tuned to this channel. Would really appreciate if you're enjoying this series so far to like, share, and subscribe, because it helps out the algorithm on the channel. So the more persons are subscribed, the more persons will get to see these videos, and the more persons will learn about the origin of things as we make our way through the book of Genesis. Thanks for watching, and have yourselves a great day.